Tsar for less than 24 hours. I think there's another general lesson here, that when confronted with a mass popular opposition and no effective means of countering it, a ruling class prefers to surrender rather than to die gloriously. This doesn't necessarily mean that some of them don't think, well, you know, it's better to live so we can fight another day. In fact, as we'll see later on, some elements of the Tsarist regime in September did try to overthrow the provisional government, but without success. So what basically had happened was that the Tsarist regime and its army had collapsed under the impact of the war with Germany. I mean, the Russian army was never going to defeat the German army, and it didn't, though it did have some initial successes against the army of the equally ramshackle Austro-Hungarian Empire at the beginning of the war. In fact, if you want to know about the Austro-Hungarian army, read the Good Soldier Strike, which is written by a Czech who was in that army. So Russia had the numbers in terms of troops, but it didn't have the training, and above all, it didn't have the military industrial backup. So the result was the demoralization of the army and discontent and unrest at home. It just took an incident, such as, let's say, the women textile workers demanding more bread, to start a series of demonstrations, strikes, and mutinies that led to the collapse of Tsarism in just 5 days. And this was, as we say today, an example or expression of people power. And in fact, this has been a feature of all past revolutions. Though afterwards, power hasn't remained in the hands of the people, power has always passed to some minority, which is also the case in Russia, as we shall see. Now, after the overthrow of the Tsar, effective political power was in the hands of the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, or delegates, and its executive committee. Nothing could happen in St. Petersburg without the authority of the executive committee of the Congress of Soviets. I mean, as I said, as the chief of police said, there was no telephone communication. They took their orders not from the Tsarist ministers, but from the executive committee of the Soviet. And Soviet, incidentally, is just a Russian word meaning council. And the Soviets sprang up all over the country after the overthrow of the Tsar, and were in fact the most representative political bodies in Russia at that time. And they were, if you like, the very rough equivalent of parliament and local councils. Now, many, in fact, most of the delegates to the Soviets consider themselves to be socialists. We would recognize very few of them as socialists in our sense. Most were either supporters of a non-Marxist, anti-Tsarist revolutionary party known as the Social Revolutionary Party, or SRs. Or they were like the leaders and members of the German Social Democratic Party of the time. They were reformists who employed Marxist concept and language. Then the Mensheviks, I take it to go in to explain who the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks are. I mean, you must have heard this many times, but I will do if somebody wants to ask a question about it. Anyway, the Marxists, well, that's an interesting Freudian slip, I should say, the Mensheviks took the view correctly that socialism was out of the question in Russia, and that capitalism was the only way forward from the semi-feudalism of Tsarism. They also took the view, more controversially, that the best people to preside over the development of capitalism were the direct political representatives of the capitalist class itself. And basically what they wanted was that the Russian Revolution should be a classic bourgeois revolution carried out by the bourgeoisie. Instead, if I'm using the word bourgeoisie, this illustrates the point I made at the beginning, that the concept of a revolution which dominated people who call themselves revolutionists or revolutionaries in the 19th century was the French Revolution. I mean, bourgeoisie is just a French word for capitalist class here. Anyway, they wanted the Russian Revolution to be, as I say, a classic bourgeois revolution which would be led and carried out by the bourgeoisie. And they saw the way forward for Russia politically as a bourgeois democratic republic with themselves as the opposition party. So, although they could have taken full power for themselves and formed a government, they refused to do so. Instead, they pressed for the formation of a provisional government which would be made up of representatives of the bourgeoisie, which they eventually got, though one minister who we'll meet again, Alexander Kerensky, who was a socialist, in inverted commas, linked to the SRs, managed to get him appointed through his own wangling initiative as the Minister of Justice. But the idea was that the Soviets would exert external pressure on this bourgeois government, say from the outside. Now this was basically an untenable position, and eventually the leaders of the SRs and the Mensheviks were drawn into the government. And the problem was that all the various provisional governments, in about 4 or 5 of them, whether composed exclusively of the bourgeois parties as from March to May, or with minority socialist inverted commas participation from May to July, or with the socialists once again in inverted commas. You can see these inverted commas under Kerensky from July. All these governments pursued a policy which went directly against what was one of the main aims of those who carried out the February Revolution, in other words, to take Russia out of the war. They wanted to continue the war, and they tried to mobilize the army to fight against Germany. And of course, every time they tried, they got defeated. So what happened was they gradually lost support, and they gradually lost credibility. And another thing that they failed to do, because they couldn't agree amongst themselves with the bourgeois liberals who were in the government, they refused to settle the land question in the only way in which it could reasonably be settled, in fact was being settled, and that was by the peasants appropriating the land of the landowners and of the squirearchy. Now this gave the Bolsheviks their chance. Ever since Lenin returned to Russia in the famous sealed train that went through Switzerland and Germany to Russia, and he arrived there in April, which incidentally was still April here as it happens, it's been the official policy of the Bolshevik Party to seize power in the more or less immediate future, or near future. And they advanced the slogans, peace, bread, and land. In doing so, they were expressing the views of the majority of those who supported the Soviets and were represented in them. In fact, in July, the militant workers and soldiers pushed the Bolsheviks into a premature attempt to seize power. I mean, it failed, and it was crushed by the provisional government. I mean, Trotsky was arrested, and Lenin had to go into hiding, where he remained until the Bolsheviks seized power in October, November. Now, it was at this point that the pro-Tsarist elements decided to stage a comeback. I mean, the commander-in-chief of the army, it was called General Kornilov, tried to march on St. Petersburg. It failed, once again, because the army rank and file wouldn't go along with it. I mean, they had a regiment of Muslims from the Caucasus who they thought, they wouldn't mind slaughtering Russians. But in fact, what the revolutionists did, they found a mufti or an imam and sent him out to speak to these people. And they said, oh, okay, we're not going to attack you. So the whole attempt failed. We couldn't even use Muslim troops and people like that to crush the revolution. But the Bolshevik party wasn't so stupid as to think that it could seize power in its own name. What they did was they pursued a more intelligent policy, from their own point of view. They aimed to win a majority in the Soviets, and then to use that majority to get the Soviets to form the government directly. So they advanced the slogan, all power to the Soviets, which was a popular slogan. In fact, in some sense, even a reasonable slogan, because the political power was effectively in the hands of the Soviets anyway, and it was an idea that was supported by many others besides the Bolsheviks. And what the Bolsheviks meant, of course, was all power to the Soviets when they have a Bolshevik majority. Now, the Bolsheviks won their majority in the St. Petersburg Soviet on the 9th of September, and on the 10th of September, the St. Petersburg Soviet voted to set up